When I was in 4th grade, I got my very first game console. It was a hand-me-down PlayStation that a friend gave me because he was going to get the new PS2 when it came out. I had played plenty of games before at friends' houses, in arcades, and even on my dad's old PC, but I never had a system of my own. So I ran home, plugged my system into my 13-inch CRT TV, and played the night away. I played a ton of games on my new system, but it wasn't until I popped in a copy of Tony Hawk's Pro Skater that I really fell in love with video games. And I'm not alone in that. If you look through the comments on pretty much any Pro Skater video or forum post, you'll find tons of people talking about how the games influenced their childhood. Some got into skateboarding after playing the games, some really found new and exciting music that influenced their musical taste, and others, like me, found a lifelong hobby of video games the first time they dropped into the warehouse. Developers and publishers strive to make games as fun to play as Pro Skater, Underground, American Wasteland, and, well, maybe not that one, but very few prevail. In this series, we're going to take a look at how Tony Hawk games came to be, tour the highs and lows of the 19-game series, and talk about the impact that the series has had in the almost 2 decades since its first release. "1999 was a very good year to be into skateboarding. Skate parks were popping up all over the world, events like the X Games attracted hundreds of thousands of spectators, and you could still listen to ska without having to pretend you were listening to it ironically. 1999 also saw the release of Tony Hawk's Pro Skater for the PlayStation, a game that would change the landscape of video games and skateboarding forever. But let's first talk about how Tony Hawk games came to exist at all. By the late 90s, skateboarding games were not a new idea. Games like 720 Degrees and Skate or Die had been bringing skateboarding to arcades and home consoles since the mid-80s. More recently, EA had put out the unfortunate Street Skater on PlayStation, and Sega had Top Skater in arcades. Developers and publishers saw a resurgence in interest in skateboarding and knew there was money to be made. During this time, an unknown developer pitched a skateboarding game to Activision, a publishing company that was at the time uncertain of their future. But they failed to secure a deal. Maybe the pitch wasn't good enough for Activision, or maybe they just didn't trust this developer to make it. Either way, executives at Activision now had skateboarding on their minds, and the wheels were set into motion that would lead them to one of their most successful franchises. Eventually, Activision decided they did want a skateboarding game. The demand for anything skateboarding was high, and the supply of quality skateboarding games was very low. So if they could make one and get it out for the 1999 holiday season, surely they could turn a profit. The deadline was set, all they needed now was a developer they could trust, a developer who could meet a deadline, a developer that had the tools and skills necessary to make this type of game, a developer like Neversoft. Activision and Neversoft already had a strong relationship. Neversoft had just finished work on Activision's shooter Apocalypse, a PlayStation game starring Bruce Willis. They had taken on the project after Activision was having serious trouble turning the millions they spent on development and Bruce Willis's likeness into a good game. They tasked Neversoft with fixing the game and gave them a firm deadline just 6 months away. Neversoft met and exceeded the expectations, turning Apocalypse into a fun-to-play game despite the deadline. So using the skills and technology they developed while working on Apocalypse, Neversoft began development on an unnamed skateboarding game. They modified the Apocalypse engine, which proved to be a great fit. Early tech demos for the game even used a machine gun-toting Bruce Willis as the player character. Neversoft did have one tiny problem though. They knew practically nothing about skateboarding. In fact, a significant source of inspiration early on in development came not from first-hand knowledge of skateboarding, watching videos, or even talking to those who did know about it. Inspiration was found in the bowling alley across the street from their office, where they often had lunch. I can't imagine that this bowling alley served very high-quality food, but they did have a Top Skater machine. Top Skater was this huge arcade machine that had players stand on a board to control their character through a course of checkpoints while pulling off tricks along the way, always moving forward. The board controller wasn't the best, but the game's structure was solid. It was fast-paced, had an over-the-top look and feel, and a licensed soundtrack by punk rock band Pennywise. The general structure would serve as the foundation for Neversoft's project. Bowling alleys weren't the only unlikely source of inspiration during the development of Pro Skater. In the game, players would progress by collecting VHS tapes after completing certain objectives. This was inspired directly by collecting stars in the least punk rock video game you could think of, Super Mario 64. Developers attempted to immerse themselves in skateboarding culture during development. Lead artist Silvio Pareto watched as many popular skateboarding videos as he could get his hands on, visited skate shops, and even educated himself on skating fashion. While doing this research, the team at Neversoft noticed a big difference between what they were seeing in games like Top Skater and what they saw when watching real-world events like the X Games. In Top Skater, the player was always moving forward in a very linear fashion, jumping off of ramps and grinding on rails along the way on a set course with a distinct beginning and end. In real life, skaters made their own path through a skate park or street, using whatever features they thought would make up the best run, and often returning to the same spot multiple times. To capture the sense of freedom that they now realized was so important in skating, Neversoft made the levels open areas that the player could explore however they wanted. The only things that were set in place were the start points and time limits. One level, called Downhill Jam, did keep the spirit of the original linear design and started the player at the top of a long downhill course similar to Top Skater. At this point, the game finally resembled what we now know as Pro Skater, but there was still plenty of work to do. It was time for Neversoft to bring in an expert.
Check out the inside look at skating's top pro and vertical master, the one, the only, Tony Hawk.
In 1998, Tony Hawk was not yet a household name, but he was one of the most influential and successful skaters in the sport. He was also a gamer who enjoyed arcades, his Super Nintendo, and his N64. He was an almost obvious choice for Neversoft's new game. In a meeting, Hawk played a demo of the game and really liked it. He signed on and the game continued development as Tony Hawk's Pro Skater. Tony Hawk wanted Pro Skater to be a game for skaters. He saw games like 720 Degrees and the upcoming Rockstar game Skate and Destroy as fun, but inauthentic to skateboarding as a sport. And he never thought the game would be so successful that it would inspire gamers to buy skateboards. Neversoft made deals with skating companies to put their brands and board designs in the game for free, on the assumption that the exposure would likely bring new business to these brands. They also worked on licensing songs for the soundtrack, and ended up with tracks from several artists including Dead Kennedys, Goldfinger, and Suicidal Tendencies. This track list would go on to become known as one of the greatest soundtracks in video game history. As development was nearing completion, it became apparent that Tony Hawk's Pro Skater was not just a good game, it was a fantastic game. Banking on future success, Activision offered a lifetime buyout to Tony Hawk to put his name and likeness in future games. It was more money than Hawk knew what to do with, but he turned it down. Tony Hawk knew how to conduct business, and knew that if Activision was trying to buy him out, it meant they were expecting to have to pay him a lot in future royalties. Over the next several years, the franchise would sell over $1 billion worth of games, and Tony would realize he made the right call. If being one of the best skateboarders in the world, and having an upcoming video game, wasn't enough to make 1999 a great year for Tony Hawk, his performance at the year's X Games certainly was. On June 27th, just a few months before the release of Pro Skater, Tony Hawk became the first skateboarder to ever land the 900, cementing himself as a legend of the sport. This accomplishment made news in outlets around the world and increased his name recognition, which of course could only help an upcoming game that said Tony Hawk right on the cover. On August 31st, 1999, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater was released for the Sony PlayStation. It was an instant hit. Reviews came pouring in, with most giving perfect or close to perfect scores. Work was quickly done to port the game to other systems, including the Nintendo 64 in March of 2000, and the Dreamcast in May. An adaptation of the game was even made for the Game Boy Color and released in March of 2000, though it wasn't received nearly as well as the main game. It was clear that Neversoft and Activision had something special on their hands. All they had to do now was not screw it up.